She had one letter, no family, no money, and the last train out of town had already left. At 58 years old, Martha Boone stood alone on a Frontier Depot platform as darkness swallowed the last light of day, holding a piece of paper that told her, in polite and careful handwriting, that nobody was coming. The people who promised her a home had already moved on, and every single person in that dusty little town walked past her like she was part of the furniture, worn out, outdated, and better off forgotten. But one man stopped, and what happened next would change both their lives forever. If this kind of story moves you, hit that like button. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The depot at Caldwell Crossing was not a place anyone chose to linger. It was a squat, weathered building, built with the kind of rough ambition that the frontier demanded but never quite rewarded. The planks along the platform had warped over the years until they buckled in the middle like the spine of an old horse that had been ridden too hard for too long. The oil lamp above the main entrance flickered constantly, throwing restless shadows across the faces of anyone standing beneath it, making even the most ordinary expression look haunted. On the evening of October 14th, 1887, the last westbound train had pulled out of Caldwell Crossing 22 minutes ahead of schedule, a fact that the station master, a wiry man named Gerald Pratt, considered a personal achievement worth mentioning to at least 4 separate people before the night was over. Most passengers had already scattered into the town or loaded themselves into waiting wagons. The platform had gone quiet in the way frontier platforms always did after a train departed. Suddenly, completely, like a fire that had run out of things to burn. Only one person remained. Martha Boone sat on a bench at the far end of the platform, the kind of bench that existed not for comfort, but for the appearance of hospitality. It was hard and narrow and slightly tilted to the right. Her traveling trunk, a large battered thing reinforced with iron corners and covered in the scuffs and scratches of 30 years of hard use, sat on the platform beside her feet. She kept one hand resting on top of it, not because she feared anyone would take it, but because it was the only solid thing left to hold on to. She had been on trains for 4 days. 4 days of hard wooden seats and soot through cracked windows and the constant rhythmic shuddering that worked its way into your bones until you forgot what stillness felt like. She had eaten sparingly. A heel of bread she'd brought herself, a boiled egg purchased at a stop in Missouri, a cup of weak coffee that had tasted mostly of tin. She had slept sitting upright, her head tipped against the window glass, waking every hour or so with a stiff neck and the particular disorientation of not knowing which state she was in. She had endured all of it because at the end of it, there was supposed to be family. Her late husband's cousin, Edmund Farley, and his wife Ruth had written to her in August. The letter had been warm enough, neighborly, even generous. "There is room for you here, Martha, should you find yourself in need of it. The territory is rough but honest, and we would not see families suffer alone." She had read that letter so many times the fold lines had started to split. She had packed what she could carry, sold the rest of what remained after James's death, and trusted those words the way you trust a bridge, completely and without looking down. The letter waiting for her at the depot desk had been considerably shorter. She unfolded it again now, though she had already memorized every word. "Martha, by the time you read this, we will have already departed for Oregon. Edmund's lungs have worsened in this climate, and the doctor says we have no choice. We are sorry for the trouble. We hope you will find suitable arrangements. We cannot take on another burden at this time. Ruth Farley." Another burden. Martha folded the letter carefully and placed it back into her coat pocket. Her fingers were steady. She had not allowed herself to fall apart at the desk when Gerald Pratt slid the envelope across the counter with the expression of a man handing over bad news that was absolutely none of his problem. She had not fallen apart when she carried her trunk out to the platform by herself because no one offered to help. She was not going to fall apart now. But her eyes had been burning for the better part of an hour. She pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose and breathed slowly. Around her, the town of Caldwell Crossing moved through its evening routines with cheerful indifference to her existence. Across the main road, the lights of the Silver Horn Saloon were already bright and loud, voices and piano music spilling out every time the door swung open. A group of young ranch hands rode past on the road, laughing about something one of them had said. A woman with 2 young children hurried along the boardwalk on the other side of the street, pulling her coat tighter against the October chill. Nobody looked at the bench at the end of the platform. Or rather, they looked and then they looked away. Martha noticed this. After 58 years of living, she had become unusually fluent in the language of being overlooked. The quick glance followed by the deliberate redirect of attention. The way people found something very urgent to examine on the opposite side of the street. It was a particular skill. The ability to see someone and simultaneously decide that seeing them carried obligations you weren't prepared to accept. Gerald Pratt emerged from the station office with his coat on, clearly preparing to lock up. He walked to the end of the platform, stopped a few feet from Martha's bench, and cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, "depot closes at 8. Martha looked up at him. "What time is it now?" "7:15. "I see." She didn't move. "Is there a boarding house in town?" Pratt scratched the back of his neck. "Widow Callahan runs a place on 2nd Street, but she don't take in." He stopped, seemed to recalculate something. "She's particular about her guests. She doesn't take in women traveling alone." He didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. "What about the hotel?" "Frontier Lodge charges $2 a night." He said it in a tone that made the price sound like a natural disaster, something outside anyone's control. Martha was quiet for a moment. She had $11.40 in the small cloth purse tucked inside her traveling coat. She had done the arithmetic on the train, in the careful, methodical way she approached every problem she couldn't afford to panic about. $11. No job. No family. No plan beyond the one that had just dissolved in her hands like wet paper. "Thank you," she said, because there was nothing else useful to say to Gerald Pratt. He lingered another moment, looking not quite at her, then went back inside. The temperature had dropped noticeably in the last half hour. Martha could feel it working through the wool of her coat, settling in her shoulders and the small of her back. She reached into her trunk and pulled out a heavier shawl, dark blue, slightly worn at one corner where she'd caught it on a nail 2 winters ago and never gotten around to fixing the pull properly. She wrapped it around her shoulders. The lamp above the station entrance was still throwing its restless light. An older man passed by on the road below the platform, glanced up at her and said something quietly to the younger man walking beside him. They both laughed. She couldn't hear the words, but she understood the shape of them well enough. Old woman. Alone. Nobody's problem. She had been someone's problem once. James Boone had made her feel like the opposite of a problem for 26 years. He had been a farmer, methodical, patient, not given to grand speeches or romantic gestures, but reliable in the way that good soil is reliable. He showed up. He stayed. When things were hard, he put his hand on her back and said, "We'll figure it out, Martha. We always do." They hadn't always figured it out beautifully. There were bad harvests and sick animals, and a winter in '74 that nearly took everything. But they figured it out together, and that had been enough. James had been gone for 14 months now. She hadn't figured out how to do together by herself yet. A group of women from what appeared to be a church gathering crossed the road nearby, their skirts rustling over the hard-packed dirt. One of them, a stout woman in a green bonnet, saw Martha on the platform and spoke briefly to her companions. 2 of them glanced over. Martha met their eyes steadily, the way she'd learned to meet the eyes of people deciding something about her. The woman in the green bonnet looked away first. They moved on down the road. Martha exhaled very slowly. She was tired in a way that sleep probably couldn't fix. The deep, bone-level tiredness of someone who had been holding themselves upright through sheer determination for a very long time. She thought about James. She thought about her kitchen back in Ohio, which she'd had to give up when the bank took the farm after the debts came due. She thought about the box of photographs she hadn't been able to fit in the trunk and had left with a neighbor who probably wouldn't keep them. She did not let herself think about what came next, because what came next was a cliff edge she wasn't ready to look over. Instead, she opened her trunk and took out her small sewing kit and the shirt she'd been mending for the past 2 days on the train. A plain blue work shirt that had belonged to James, that she couldn't bring herself to throw out, that she kept repairing out of habit or stubbornness or both. She threaded the needle in the uncertain lamplight with the practiced ease of a woman who had been doing such things in poor light for decades. She sewed. The town moved around her. Lights came on and went off. The silver horn got louder and then quieter. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The temperature continued to fall. Around 7:30, two young station workers came out to move some cargo near the platform. They were maybe 19 or 20, broad-shouldered and unhurried in the way of young men who have never had a reason to hurry. "Somebody ought to tell the old lady the train ain't coming back," one of them said, not troubling himself to lower his voice. "Maybe she lives on the bench," the other one said, and they both found this extremely funny. Martha kept her eyes on her sewing. The needle went in, came out, went in again, in, out, in, out. She had discovered a long time ago that needlework was an excellent thing to do when you needed your hands to be busy, so your face didn't have to be. The young men finished with their cargo and moved on, still laughing. The night deepened around the platform. Gerald Pratt came out again at 8:05, this time with the deliberate energy of a man who was going home for supper and considered this entirely reasonable. "Ma'am, I need to lock the—" "I heard you the first time." He stopped. Martha folded the shirt carefully and placed it back in her sewing kit. She stood up, slowly, because her back had stiffened from the cold and the hard bench, and because 58-year-old bodies simply required more negotiation than they used to. She straightened her coat. She adjusted her shawl. "I'll need a moment to arrange my trunk," she said, in the tone of a woman who was not asking for his opinion. "Yes, ma'am." She fastened the trunk's clasps. She sat on the edge of the platform, lowered herself carefully to the ground, her knees protesting in their particular way, and then tried to figure out how to move a trunk that weighed considerably more than she could comfortably manage by herself. She had managed it so far through a combination of determination, awkward dragging, and timing her efforts with the rhythm of her own breathing. She gripped the handle on one end and pulled. The trunk moved about 6 inches. She stopped, repositioned her grip, pulled again. 8 inches this time. She was so focused on the problem of the trunk that she didn't hear the wagon until it had already stopped nearby. The sound of hooves going quiet and the creak of wood settling under shifting weight. "That's a heavy-looking trunk, ma'am." The voice was low and direct, not unkind, but not soft either. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who didn't waste words on things they didn't mean. Martha looked up. The man standing near the edge of the platform was tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas coat that had seen several hard winters and a hat pulled low against the wind. He had the kind of face that had spent years outdoors, weathered, sharp-lined, with deep-set eyes that were currently looking at her with a directness that was either rude or refreshingly honest, and she hadn't decided which. He was perhaps 40, maybe a year or two either side of it. He looked like he hadn't shaved in 4 or 5 days, and he didn't look like he'd given it any thought. She straightened up from the trunk. "It is," she said. "I'm managing." He looked at the trunk. He looked at her. He looked at the distance between the trunk and the road in a way that suggested he was doing the same arithmetic she had been doing and arriving at the same conclusion. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "I haven't determined that yet." He didn't react to this the way most people would have, with the uncomfortable shuffle and the redirected gaze and the sudden urgent business elsewhere. He just stood there, looking at her steadily. "You got family in town?" "No." "Waiting on someone?" "No." A beat of silence. "Have you eaten today, ma'am?" The question was so simple and so direct and so completely unexpected that Martha felt something lock up in her throat, a sudden tightness that had nothing to do with the cold. She had eaten half a biscuit at noon. "That's not your concern," she said, because she was not yet in the habit of accepting things from strangers, and she was not going to start by admitting weakness to one. The man reached up and adjusted his hat. He didn't look offended. He didn't look particularly deterred either. "My name's Colton Hayes," he said. "I've got a ranch about 6 miles north. I came into town for supplies." He gestured briefly at the wagon behind him, which was loaded with feed sacks, rope, and several other things she couldn't identify in the dark. "There's a decent place to eat on the main road. Della's. They do a hot supper until 9. Martha looked at him. She had spent 58 years developing an accurate read of people's intentions, and what she saw in Colton Hayes' face was not charity or pity or anything that required her to feel smaller for accepting it. It was the particular expression of a man who had noticed a problem and was attempting to solve it in the most practical way available to him. "Why?" she asked. He seemed mildly surprised by the question. "Because it's cold," he said, "and you look like you've been sitting on that bench for a while." It was not a romantic answer. It was not a heroic answer. It was an honest one, and after 4 days of hard travel and a letter that had used the word burden and hours of being invisible to everyone in this town, honest was the thing that finally broke through. "I have," she admitted. "Then come eat something," Colton Hayes said. "And if you want, you can tell me what you're going to do after that, and maybe between the two of us we can figure something out." Martha Boone looked at the man. She looked at the dark street behind her. She looked at the trunk, and at her own cold hands, and at the lamp above the depot entrance that was still throwing its restless light over everything. She picked up her traveling bag. "All right," she said, "but I won't be charity." "Didn't offer charity," Colton said, moving to the other end of the trunk without being asked. "I offered supper." And he lifted his end of the trunk as though it weighed nothing at all. Not to impress her, she could tell, but simply because it needed moving and he was there. And together they carried it toward the wagon. The night was cold, and the road ahead was dark, and Martha Boone had absolutely no idea what came next. But for the first time in 14 months, she wasn't carrying things alone. Della's was not much to look at. It was a narrow room with 6 tables, mismatched chairs, and a long counter along one wall where a heavy-set woman in a flour-dusted apron moved between a cast-iron stove and a row of coffee cups, with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this particular job for 20 years and had stopped finding it interesting around year 3. The smell of the place, though, salt pork and coffee and something with onions going soft in a pan, hit Martha the moment she walked through the door, and her stomach responded in a way that was almost embarrassing. She had not realized how hungry she was until the smell told her. Colton Hayes pulled out a chair for her at a corner table without making a ceremony of it. Just did it the way he'd lifted the trunk, because it was the next logical thing to do. And settled himself across from her with the unhurried ease of a man who was not particularly concerned about appearances. The woman from behind the counter came over. She looked at Martha first, then at Colton, then back at Martha with the frank curiosity of someone who had watched this town for long enough to notice when something didn't fit the usual pattern. "Evening, Colton." Her name, Martha would learn, was Della Marsh, the same Della the place was named after, who had started the restaurant with her late husband's savings 12 years ago and had been running it alone for the last 4. "Who's your friend?" "Martha Boone," Colton said. "She came in on the afternoon train." "Passing through?" There was a brief pause, the kind that contained more information than most sentences. "Undecided," Martha said. Della looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a woman who understood what undecided meant, when it was said by another woman sitting across from a man she'd clearly just met. It was not an unkind look. It was a measuring one. "We've got beef stew and cornbread tonight," Della said. "Coffee's fresh." "Please," Martha said, and the word came out quieter than she intended. Colton ordered the same. Della went back to the counter. The restaurant had 2 other occupied tables. A pair of men in work clothes eating with their eyes down, and a younger couple in the far corner who were too absorbed in each other to notice anything. Martha unwrapped her hands from her shawl and set them on the table. In the lamplight of the restaurant, she noticed for the first time how rough her knuckles had gotten. Reddened from the cold, the skin cracked at 2 of the joints. She had good hands, always had. Working hands. She folded them together now and tried to think clearly. Colton was looking at her, not with the staring bluntness of someone cataloging her flaws, but with the quiet patience of a man who is waiting without pressure. "The letter," she said, because there was no point in dancing around it. "The family I came to find, they'd already left the territory by the time I arrived, left word at the station." "How far did you travel?" "Ohio." Something shifted slightly in his expression. 4 days on the train, then." "About that, yes." He was quiet for a moment. "And you didn't know they'd gone?" "I would not have come if I had known," Martha said, with a dryness she hadn't intended to let out but couldn't help. The faintest thing, not quite a smile, but in that neighborhood, crossed his face. It was gone quickly. "You got money?" he asked. Then immediately, "That's an impolite question. You don't have to answer it." "I have $11, she said, "which is enough for a few nights at the hotel and not much beyond that." She paused. "I'm not telling you that to ask for something. I'm telling you so you understand the situation plainly." "I appreciate plain," he said. Della brought the stew. It was thick and hot, with big pieces of potato and carrot and beef that had been cooking long enough to fall apart easily. Martha picked up her spoon and ate with the controlled discipline of a woman who wanted badly to eat fast but wasn't going to. It was the best thing she had tasted in 4 days, which was not an especially high bar, but still. Colton ate without talking, which she appreciated. There was no performance in him, no effort to fill silence with noise. He ate. He drank his coffee. He watched the room occasionally, the way people do when they're thinking about something they haven't said yet. When the bowls were mostly empty, he set his spoon down. "I've got a ranch 6 miles north," he said. "Like I mentioned, 800 acres, about 60 head of cattle, a cabin, a barn that needs new siding on the east wall." He said all of this in the matter-of-fact inventory style of a man summarizing a situation. "I live alone. Been alone out there for about 6 years. Martha waited. "I'm not offering charity," he said, echoing her own words back to her with a deliberateness that told her he'd remembered them. "But the cabin's got a back room that's been used for storage. It's got a window and a floor and 4 walls, and I could clear it out by tomorrow." He picked up his coffee cup, seemed to realize it was empty, set it down again. "You'd have a place to think without paying hotel rates, and He stopped, seemed to re-examine what he was about to say. "The place could use someone who knows how to run a kitchen. I've been eating my own cooking for 6 years and it's not improving." Martha looked at him across the table. She was trying to find the angle, the thing underneath the offer that would make it make the kind of sense that required her to be cautious. She had not survived 58 years by being naive. Men on the frontier who offered things to women traveling alone generally wanted something in return that she was not in the position to give and not inclined to negotiate about. But Colton Hayes was not looking at her the way those men looked. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a practical problem that has a practical solution, if both parties are willing to be reasonable about it. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I know you came 4 days on a train alone on the word of family that let you down," he said. "I know you didn't fall apart at the depot even though you had reasonable cause to. And I know you eat stew like a person who hasn't had a real meal in days, but you're not going to admit it." He shrugged, one shoulder. "That's enough to start." Martha was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the wind had picked up. She could hear it working at the loose boards somewhere on the building's exterior. The temperature had dropped again while they were eating. October on the frontier was not forgiving. "If I find work in town," she said slowly, "or a proper arrangement somewhere else, then you go," Colton said. "No argument from me. And I'll do my share. I don't sit still and I don't accept handouts." "I heard you the first time." She looked at him for another moment. Then she exhaled. Not dramatically, just the quiet release of someone who has been holding tension for a long time and is making a decision to set it down. "All right," she said. "I'll see the room." He nodded once. That was all. The road to the Hayes Ranch took 40 minutes by wagon on a dark October night, and it was not a comfortable 40 minutes. The track north of town was rutted and uneven, and the wagon had springs that had seen better decades. Martha held the side rail and kept her back straight and watched the land open up around them, wide and dark and immense in the way the frontier was. With a sky so full of stars it looked almost aggressive, like the darkness was trying to compensate for something. Colton drove without talking much. He pointed out a ridgeline to the northeast that he said was visible from his property on clear mornings. He mentioned that the winter came early this far into the territory, sometimes by the end of October, and that last year they'd had snow on the ground before Halloween. He said this not as a warning, but as information, the kind of thing you told someone so they could make accurate plans. She asked him how long he'd had the ranch. 12 years, he said. Came out here from Tennessee. Worked for another outfit for 3 years, saved what I could, bought this parcel when the previous owner took sick and sold it cheap. He was quiet for a moment. It's good land. Better than it looks from the road. Why alone? She asked. 6 years is a long time. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. My wife passed, he said. In 81. Fever. Another pause. She was 29. I'm sorry, Martha said, and meant it without adornment. Been a while, he said, which was not the same as saying it didn't still matter, and they both understood that. The ranch appeared out of the darkness gradually. First the shape of the barn against the sky, then the low square outline of the cabin, then the fence lines materializing in the wagon lamp's reach. It was not a beautiful property. It was a working one. There was a practical plainness to everything. The placement of the structures, the way the fence followed the natural contour of the land, the woodpile stacked high and tight against the cabin's north wall in a way that meant someone had thought carefully about weather. Colton helped her down from the wagon and lit a lamp inside the cabin before she entered. The main room was functional. That was the honest word. There was a stone fireplace that clearly worked well, based on the blackening above the mantel. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf of tools and tack. A smaller shelf with a few items she couldn't make out. The floor was swept, but not recently. There was a coat hung on a peg by the door and a pair of muddy boots beside it, and a tin cup sitting on the table that had been there a while. It was the room of a man who had stopped trying to make a place look like anything other than what it was. The back room was smaller, by maybe 10 feet square, with a narrow window facing east. It was stacked with wooden crates and coils of rope and a broken saddle frame and the accumulated detritus of a man who had been putting things somewhere else for 6 years. A cobweb occupied the upper corner with considerable confidence. "I said I'd clear it by tomorrow," Colton said from the doorway behind her. "Tonight," Martha said. He looked at her. "I'll help," she said. "It'll take an hour between the two of us. I'm not sleeping in the wagon." He considered this for approximately 2 seconds. "Fair enough." It took closer to an hour and a half because some of the crates were heavier than expected, and there was a disagreement about where to put the saddle frame. Colton wanted to leave it just outside the door. Martha pointed out that this was a good way to break an ankle in the dark, and eventually they moved it to the barn, which required 2 trips because neither of them was going to admit the thing was awkward to carry. By the time the room was clear and swept, and the narrow cot that had been buried under a canvas tarp was reassembled against the wall, it was past 10 o'clock. Martha's back was a genuine complaint. Her feet were cold inside her shoes. She was so tired that the edges of her vision had gone slightly soft. But the room was clear, and it was hers for now. Colton had found an extra blanket, thick wool, slightly moth-eaten at one corner, but warm, and had left it on the cot without comment. He'd also set the small lamp on the floor just inside the door. "Outhouse is 20 yards northeast of the barn," he said from the doorway. "I'll get the stove going in the morning before you're up." He paused. "You drink coffee?" "Desperately," she said. "Good." He looked at her for a moment, not in any complicated way, just looking. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Boone." "Martha," she said. He nodded once. "Martha." And he pulled the door to T, not closed because it didn't close properly, the frame having warped over the years. And she heard his boots cross the main room and the other door open and shut as he went out to finish with the horses. Martha sat down on the edge of the cot. The lamp threw a small circle of yellow light around her. Outside the narrow window, the wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. Somewhere in the dark, a horse made a low sound and then went quiet. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket. Another burden. She thought about the depot bench and the women who had looked away and Gerald Pratt and his clocks. She thought about Ohio and the farm and a kitchen she'd known for 26 years, the way the floorboards creaked near the back door, the particular angle of the morning light across the table in summer. She was 58 years old, and she was in a 10-foot room on a stranger's ranch with a moth-eaten blanket and nothing resolved. She lay down on the cot without undressing, too tired for it, and pulled the blanket up and was asleep before she had time to decide how she felt about any of it. She woke before dawn. This was not unusual. Martha had been waking before dawn since she was a girl, and decades of farming life had calcified it into something that functioned independently of intention. Her body simply decided the night was over, and that was that. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to the unfamiliar ceiling and the particular quality of the silence. Bigger than indoor silence, more textured, with the sound of wind and the distant low sound of cattle and the creak of the cabin's wood adjusting to the cold. Then she got up. The main room was cold, but there were coals still in the fireplace. She found wood in a box near the hearth and got the fire going with the methodical ease of a woman who had done it every morning of her life. She found the coffee tin on the shelf. Nearly empty, she noted, the kind of nearly empty that happens when a person living alone stops noticing things running out because there's no one to mention it to. She made what coffee there was. She also, while she was looking for the coffee, took honest inventory of the kitchen shelf and the small pantry space at the back of the main room. What she found there told her several things about the man who lived here. He had flour, but it was getting old. He had salt pork in some quantity, which suggested he understood winter. He had dried beans, a jug of molasses, a small amount of cornmeal. He had 3 potatoes that were starting to think about doing something ambitious if left alone much longer. He had a cast iron skillet that hadn't been properly seasoned in what looked like years, a Dutch oven that was in better shape, and a bread tin that had never in its life been used for bread. She made cornbread. The skillet needed oil and heat first, and she gave it both, working the surface methodically while the fire built up. The cornbread mix was simple: cornmeal, a little flour, salt, molasses for sweetness, water because there was no milk, and she put it in the oven by the fire to bake while she fried the last 2 eggs she found in a small basket near the door. Cold morning, just found them probably yesterday. She was pouring the coffee when Colton came through the door. He stopped. He looked at the fire, going strong. He looked at the coffee, which he could smell. He looked at the cornbread, visible through the Dutch oven lid. He looked at Martha standing at the fireplace in her traveling coat with a wooden spoon in her hand. "I said I'd get the stove going," he said. "You were slow," she said. He sat down at the table without arguing. She put coffee in front of him, the tin cup that had been sitting on the table, which she'd washed, and he wrapped both hands around it and drank. Something in the set of his shoulders changed slightly. The way people shift when something they needed without knowing they needed it shows up. They ate without much conversation. The cornbread was not perfect. The center was slightly underdone because the oven temperature was uneven and she hadn't fully accounted for the altitude. And she said so, which made him look up with an expression of mild surprise. "It's fine," he said. "The center's a little soft. I'll know the oven better next time." He looked at her. "There's a next time. Unless you'd prefer I go back to sleeping on the depot bench," she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. He almost smiled again. She was beginning to recognize when it was about to happen, a certain quality of stillness just before, like the moment before sound. "No," he said. "Suppose I wouldn't." The days that followed established themselves with a rhythm that surprised her by how quickly it happened. She had expected friction, the awkward choreography of 2 strangers sharing a space that had been shaped entirely around one person's habits. And there was some of that. Colton's mornings started violently early, and his idea of acceptable noise levels before sunrise was calibrated to a life of solitude. He left muddy things in places she immediately identified as inconvenient and seemed genuinely baffled the first time she moved his boots to the porch. "I put those there," he said. "I know," she said. "Now they're there," pointing to the porch. He looked at the porch. He looked at where the boots had been. He opened his mouth. Then he picked up his hat and went to feed the horses, and she considered that a reasonable conclusion. But he was not difficult exactly. He was a man who had arranged his life for efficiency and solitude, and efficiency and solitude leave marks on a person. You stop narrating things out loud. Stop softening your movements for the sake of someone else in the room. Stop automatically accounting for another person's presence in small daily calculations. Martha recognized these habits because she had been developing some of them herself in the 14 months since James died. What she hadn't expected was how the cabin itself seemed to resist habitation. The first morning she made coffee, she discovered there was no system for anything in the kitchen. Things were where they'd landed, not where they made sense. The fireplace smoked slightly when the wind came from the north, which was a damper issue she'd fixed on 3 previous fireplaces in her life, and could fix on this one if she had the right tool. The back room where she slept had a gap at the base of the window frame, where the cold came through with more ambition than the moth-eaten blanket could counter. The vegetable garden, she noticed it on the second day, or what had been a vegetable garden, a small plot on the south side of the cabin that had gone completely to seed and weeds, had good soil underneath. She could tell by the color of what she disturbed when she pushed her boot into the edge of it. She didn't say anything about the garden. She just started clearing it, an hour at a time, when there was a moment between other things. The other things were constant. Colton brought her the boots that needed resoling, and she soled them. She'd done enough of her own family's shoes that it was automatic. She mended the tears in his work shirts, which were several, and washed what needed washing and hung it to dry in the cold, clear air on the south side of the barn, where the sun hit longest. She fixed the damper. Turned out she needed a particular length of wire, which Colton produced from the barn without comment, when she described what she was looking for. When the fire stopped smoking, He stood in the main room for a moment, looking at the fireplace, and then looked at her, and then went back outside. She understood that to be a thank you. By the end of the first week, the pantry had been reorganized in a way that made sense. The Dutch oven had been properly seasoned. The gap at the window frame had been caulked with a mixture of ash and clay that wasn't ideal, but would hold until spring. And the meals had progressed from eggs and cornbread to actual cooking. Bean soup with dried herbs she'd found growing wild near the fence line, a salt pork and potato stew that was considerably better than what Della had served. She would not say this out loud. Biscuits that came out right on the third try when she'd figured out the oven's temperament. Colton ate everything put in front of him without complaint and without excessive compliment. He was not the kind of man who praised food, which Martha found she preferred to men who praised it too enthusiastically. You could tell more from how quickly someone ate than from what they said about it. He ate quickly. One evening, at the end of the week, they were sitting by the fire after supper. Her with her mending, him mending something else. A section of harness that needed new stitching. When he said, without looking up from the leather, "People in town are going to talk," Martha's needle went in, came out. "Probably already are," she said. "Doesn't bother you?" She considered the question honestly. "It bothers me some," she said. "I'd be lying if I said it didn't. But I've been talked about before, and I've been cold and hungry before, and I know which bothers me more." He was quiet for a moment. "It won't be kind talk. People's talk rarely is when they can't make sense of something." She tied off a knot. "Can you make sense of it? For your own sake, I mean, because you're the one who has to live here." He looked up from the harness at that. He looked at her for a moment with that direct, unhurried gaze that she was getting used to. "I made sense of it the night at the depot," he said. "Somebody needed a hand. I had one." He shrugged, one shoulder, the same gesture she'd seen before. "People always want more complicated reasons than that." Martha looked back at her mending. She had been alone for 14 months, trying to figure out how a life reassembles itself after loss. She had learned some things in that time. She had learned that grief does not move in a straight line. She had learned that dignity is harder to hold on to than people suggest. She had learned that the world is considerably less interested in your difficulties than it was when you had someone standing beside you. She had not learned how to stop expecting the floor to drop out. But sitting in this imperfect room, by this smoky until last week fire, next to a man mending harness and not asking her to explain herself, she felt, for the first time since she'd stepped off that train into the cold, something that was not quite safety, not quite hope, but was close enough to both that she wasn't going to examine it too carefully. Outside, the wind moved across the territory the way it had moved before she arrived and would move long after. The horses were quiet in the barn. Somewhere out in the dark, the cattle were settled in the grass. Inside, the fire burned steadily, and two people who had both gotten used to silence sat together in it, and the silence was a different kind now. Less empty, more like the pause between one thing and whatever came honestly after. The talk started the way talk always starts in small frontier towns, quietly and then all at once. Martha heard the first of it on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after she'd arrived at the Hayes Ranch, when she made the trip into Caldwell Crossing with Colton to buy flour and coffee and the lamp oil they were running low on. She had not been back to town since that first night at Della's, and she was not prepared for how differently the same street looked when you were walking it rather than sitting alone in the dark, watching it move without you. People noticed. That was the simple fact of it. She walked alongside Colton toward the general store, and she watched faces register the combination of them. The big, quiet rancher who kept to himself, and the older woman nobody recognized. And she watched the calculations happen behind people's eyes. It was not a long calculation. In a town this size, where everyone knew everyone's approximate business, a strange woman at Colton Hayes' side required explanation, and since no explanation was offered, people made their own. She heard the first comment inside the store, from a woman she didn't know, spoken to another woman she didn't know, in the particular tone people use when they want you to hear something while maintaining the claim that it was a private conversation. Old enough to be his mother, but that's not what she's after, I'd imagine. Martha took a sack of cornmeal from the shelf and put it in her basket. She did not look at the women. She did not change her expression. She carried her basket to the counter and gave the storekeeper, a thin man named Horton, her list, and she stood with her back straight and her hands steady while he filled it. Colton was at the back of the store looking at rope. He hadn't heard, or if he had, he gave no indication. On the way back to the wagon, they passed two men sitting on the bench outside the saloon. It was not yet noon, which said something about the men. And one of them said, loud enough, Hayes finally found himself a grandmother to keep house. And the other one laughed with the wholehearted enthusiasm of someone who found cruelty reliably funny. Colton stopped walking. Martha put her hand briefly on his arm. Not to restrain him, he didn't seem like a man who needed restraining, but just to indicate that this was not a hill she wanted anyone to die on today. Don't, she said quietly. He looked at the men. He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at the men again. Then he picked up the supply crate and loaded it into the wagon and climbed up onto the seat, and they drove out of town without another word about it. They were a mile out before he said anything. I shouldn't have let that go. You let it go because I asked you to, Martha said. Not because it didn't bother you. It bothered me. I know. She adjusted her shawl against the road's cold wind. It bothers me too, but those men aren't the last fools we're going to meet, and I'd rather save the energy. He didn't say anything to that. I've been talked about before, she said, which was true. When James died and the bank took the farm, people talked plenty, said I must have run him into debt, said I should have managed him better, said a proper wife would have found a way. She was quiet for a moment. None of it was accurate and none of it helped, and all of it happened anyway. The talking doesn't stop because it's wrong. Colton held the reins. The horses moved steadily. A hawk turned in a slow circle above the ridge to the northeast. What did you do? He asked. When they talked, I kept working, she said, and I outlasted them. She paused. That's the only answer that ever actually works. He nodded slowly. She got the sense he was filing that somewhere. The rumors once started did not stay simple. Martha learned this through Della, who had taken to stopping her wagon near the ranch road on the mornings she drove to town, partly because the routes were adjacent, and partly, Martha suspected, because Della Marsh was a woman who appreciated knowing what was actually true before deciding what to think. They're saying you've got designs on his land, Della said one morning in early November, leaning out of her wagon seat with the frank delivery of someone who considered honesty a basic courtesy. Hattie Voss started it. She's been wanting that north parcel for her husband's grazing for 2 years, and it aggrieves her considerably that Colton won't sell. Martha looked at Della with the patient expression of someone who has heard worse. Do you believe it? I believe Hattie Voss is motivated by self-interest dressed up as community concern, Della said. Same as always. She settled back in her seat. I also believe a woman who reorganizes a stranger's pantry and grows back a vegetable garden that hasn't produced anything since 1883 is not primarily thinking about property inheritance. She gathered her reins. But that's just my reading. She drove off before Martha could decide how to respond to that. November brought the cold with a purposefulness that reminded Martha of debt collectors. Systematic, indifferent to circumstances, arriving whether you were ready or not. The morning temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there. The ground hardened to iron. The sky took on the particular flat white quality that meant the territory was preparing to do something serious about winter, and the only question was timing. Colton spent those weeks preparing with the focused intensity of a man who had done this many times and had not always done it early enough. He brought the remaining cattle in from the far pasture, repaired 2 sections of fence that might not hold under snow load, added a second layer of insulation to the south wall of the barn, using old grain sacks packed with dried grass. Martha helped where she could and stayed out of the way where she couldn't. She made sure the firewood inside was always stacked to the ceiling. She put up every preserved thing she could manage from the garden. The garden that had produced, against the odds and the lateness of the season, a modest but real amount of squash and dried beans, and the remains of what turned out to have been a very old herb plot. On the morning of November the 9th, Martha woke before dawn as usual and went to start the fire and noticed the quality of the silence outside. It was the particular silence of weather building. She opened the cabin door and looked at the sky and did not like what she saw. The clouds had moved in overnight, low and dense, and the color of old pewter, covering everything from horizon to horizon. The wind had stopped entirely, which was worse than if it had been blowing. Everything was still in the way that things get still before they stop being still. Very suddenly, and with considerable force, she went and knocked on Colton's door. He was already awake. "How long, you think?" she asked. He stood in his doorway looking at the same sky. "Tonight," he said. "Maybe sooner." "The Morrison family," Martha said. "Their place is 5 miles west. They have 3 children. I've seen them in town. I know the Morrisons. If this is bad, I'll ride out this morning and tell them." He was already reaching for his coat. "Tell the Harlan brothers, too. Their cabin's low ground near the creek." He looked at her. "The creek floods under heavy snowmelt," she said. "I noticed the watermarks on the bank last week." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "I'll tell them." He was gone within the hour. Martha used the time to fill every available vessel with water, bring in enough wood to last 4 days, check the food stores again, and move the remaining cured meat from the cold storage area at the back of the barn to the cabin where it would be accessible. She also found the extra blankets. There were 3 in varying states of usefulness, and stacked them near the fireplace. By midday, the snow had started. By mid-afternoon, it was serious. By nightfall, it was the kind of serious that changes things. Colton had made it back before the worst of it, which was the first relief. He came through the door in a gust of wind and driven snow and stood in the main room shaking the white from his coat and hat while Martha put coffee on and tried to read his expression. "Morrisons are coming," he said. "Should be here within the hour if they left when I told them to." "The Harlans?" Warren Harlan said he wasn't going anywhere. It was just a little snow. He said it with the particular flatness of a man reporting information he disagreed with but had not been able to change. His brother agreed with him. "They'll freeze. I told him that." "You can't help people who won't move," Martha said, because it was true even if it sat badly. The Morrisons arrived in 2 wagons at just past 7 in the evening. Tom Morrison, his wife Clara, who was 7 months pregnant, and their 3 children, a boy of 9 named Roy, a girl of 6 named Beth, and a baby girl not yet 2 who seemed entirely untroubled by the blizzard raging outside her blanket. Behind them came 2 other families, the Pedersen family, 5 people including a grandmother in her 70s, and a young couple named Garrett, who had been ranching on the territory for less than a year and looked like the blizzard had given them serious doubts about their life choices. Suddenly, Colton's not large cabin contained 14 people. This was, objectively, a logistical problem. Martha solved logistical problems the way she solved most problems, by starting with what she knew to be true and working outward from there. She knew the fireplace could heat the main room adequately if the door was kept shut. She knew the body heat of 14 people in an enclosed space was not nothing. She knew the children needed to be warm first, and that warm children became calm children, and calm children prevented the kind of cascading anxiety that could turn a bad situation into a worse one. She directed Clara Morrison to the chair nearest the fire with the authority of someone who expected to be listened to. Clara, who looked exhausted and frightened and about 12 years away from the frontier adventure she'd probably imagined, sat down without question. The grandmother, Elsa Pedersen, turned out to speak functional English and proved immediately useful. She took charge of the children with a Swedish no-nonsense authority that impressed Martha considerably. Tom Morrison tried to be helpful and kept standing in the middle of the room looking uncertain, which was the worst possible place to stand, so Martha gave him something specific to do. Bring in the last of the wood from the porch, stack it inside, don't stop until she said stop, and he did it with visible relief. The young couple, the Garretts, were scared and trying not to show it. The husband, Daniel, had a cough that Martha didn't like the sound of. Not the surface kind, but the deep chest kind that meant cold had already gotten in somewhere it shouldn't be. She put him closest to the fire after Clara and told his wife Ruth to keep him there. Colton moved through all of it with the efficient calm of a man managing a difficult situation on his own property, checking on the horses, bringing in extra fuel, making sure the barn doors were fully secured against the wind that was now hammering the structure with sustained, deliberate force. He and Martha crossed paths frequently in the small space and communicated primarily in practical shorthand. A look, a brief word, a gesture towards something that needed doing, with the ease of people who had been navigating the same space long enough to have developed a working language. Around 10 at night, Beth Morrison, the 6-year-old, started crying. Not the attention-seeking crying of a bored child, but the thin, high crying of a child who is scared and doesn't fully understand why and can't stop. Her mother was asleep with exhaustion in the chair, the baby on her lap. Tom was awake but helpless, in the particular way that fathers sometimes are when a child wants comfort, He doesn't know how to give. Martha sat down on the floor next to Beth. "What's your name?" Beth asked, through tears. "Martha." "Are we going to die?" Martha looked at the child with the serious, respectful attention she believed children's questions deserved, particularly the hard ones. "No," she said. "The storm is loud, but the walls are good, and the fire is going, and there are 14 of us in here, which is a lot of people to keep each other warm." Beth considered this. "It's very loud." "It is. Storms usually are." "My mama's scared." "Your mama is tired," Martha said carefully. "Tired and scared feel similar sometimes, but she's going to be fine." She told Beth a story, not a grand one, just a story about a cat she'd had as a girl in Kentucky, an orange cat named November because that was when they'd found him. It was not a particularly exciting story. It involved the cat mostly just being a cat, doing unremarkable things around a farm, occasionally getting himself into situations that required human rescue. But Beth stopped crying about 4 minutes into it and was asleep about 6 minutes after that, her head against Martha's arm. Martha sat on the floor and did not move until she was sure the child was deeply enough under that moving wouldn't wake her. When she finally eased away and stood up, carefully, because the floor and her knees had a complicated relationship, she found Colton watching her from across the room. He was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, not in a confrontational way, but in the way of someone who has been standing quietly for a while and doesn't want to interrupt. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before and couldn't quite name. She went to check the fire. The blizzard ran for 2 full days and the night between them. In that time, Martha Boone became the functional center of the Hayes cabin in the way that certain people become the center of difficult situations, not by declaring themselves essential, but by simply doing the next necessary thing, and the thing after that, and the thing after that, until people start orienting themselves around you without quite deciding to. She rationed the food carefully, not so little that anyone suffered, not so much that they ran short. She created a rotation for the sleeping spaces, making sure the children and the elderly and Clara Morrison with her heavy pregnancy were always nearest the fire. She identified that Daniel Garrett's cough was worsening on the first day and made him a chest poultice from what she had available, rendered fat, dried thyme from the herb garden remnants, a clean cloth. And his wife looked at her with such raw gratitude that Martha had to look away. She organized the older children into small tasks. Roy Morrison turned out to be remarkably capable for 9 years old, and she used this. He kept the wood moving from the stack to the fireplace, checked on the younger children, and carried things between Martha and wherever they needed to go with the seriousness of a boy who had decided this emergency was something he could be useful in. Tom Morrison, watching this, told Colton on the second day that he hadn't known what to make of Martha at first, but that he was revising his opinion considerably. Colton said, which was apparently sufficient. On the second night, Clara Morrison went into early labor. This was the moment when the room held its breath, when the theoretical difficulty of the situation became actual, immediate, and frightening. Clara's water broke a little before midnight. Tom made a sound that was not quite a word. The baby girl on Clara's lap woke up and started crying. Elsa Pettersson, who had delivered several grandchildren in Sweden in conditions that would have impressed even this room, immediately took charge of the younger children and herded them into the far corner. Colton got every man out of the main room and into the kitchen area without being asked. He just did it, quickly, with the understanding that this was the thing that needed doing. And Martha knelt in front of Clara Morrison and took both her hands and said, in a voice that was steady because it needed to be, "Look at me, Clara, just at me. You're going to be all right." "It's too early," Clara said. 5 weeks is not so early. I've seen 5 weeks do fine." "Have you done this before?" "Twice," Martha said. "A neighbor's daughter in Ohio, and once on the road to Indiana in a situation that was considerably less comfortable than this one." She squeezed Clara's hands. "You're going to have to trust me." "I trust you," Clara said immediately, without hesitation, and Martha felt the weight of that trust settle on her shoulders and consciously decided it would not buckle her. The labor lasted 4 hours. The child, a boy, small but complete and loudly unhappy about the circumstances of his arrival, was born at 6 minutes past 4 in the morning of the blizzard's second day, into Martha Boone's hands, in the flickering firelight of Colton Hayes's front room. The sound he made when he drew his first breath was the most noise anyone in that room had made in 2 days, and nobody seemed to mind. When she came out of the main room to tell the men Colton was awake, she wasn't sure he'd slept at all. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Boy or girl?" he asked. "Boy," she said. "Small but strong. Claire's well." He exhaled. Something in his face released, the sustained tension of a man who had been waiting for news and had been prepared for worse. "Good," he said. Then, "You should sleep." "I will." She was so tired her hands were trembling slightly. She'd noticed this an hour ago and simply kept working. "In a while." "Martha." She looked at him. "I don't know what would have happened tonight without you," he said. Not dramatically, just as a statement of the thing he believed to be true. She looked at this man, rough-edged and plain-spoken, sitting in his own kitchen at 4 a.m. because 14 people needed his roof, and he hadn't thought twice about offering it, with 3 days of beard and tired eyes and coffee going cold in his hand. "You'd have managed," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to." She went to the back room and lay down on her cot, and was asleep in the time it took the wind to make one more slow pass over the roof. Outside, the blizzard was finally beginning to tire. The snow had thinned, the wind had dropped to something that merely complained instead of threatened. By dawn, when the sky began to lighten along the eastern ridge, the storm had burned itself out the way all storms eventually do, leaving behind a world that was silent and white and completely rearranged. The families who'd sheltered in Colton's cabin began digging out the following morning, grateful and subdued and changed in the way people are changed by having been genuinely frightened and then genuinely safe. Tom Morrison shook Colton's hand for a long time without saying much. Clara, pale and exhausted in the chair by the fire, her new son bundled against her chest, looked at Martha with an expression that had no word in it. Just recognition, clear and simple, of what the night had cost and what it had been worth. Only Hattie Voss, arriving in town 3 days later once the roads were passable, and hearing the account from several different people, did not offer anything resembling gratitude. What she offered instead was considerably less generous and considerably more dangerous, and it was already moving through the territory by the time Martha heard about it. But that was coming. For now the snow lay quiet over everything, and in a small cabin 6 miles north of town, a fire burned steadily, and a new baby slept in his mother's arms. And 2 people who had started out as strangers sat across a table from each other in the particular silence of people who have been through something together and come out the other side still standing. Hattie Voss was not a stupid woman. That was the thing people who underestimated her tended to learn too late. She was 51 years old, sharp-faced and sharp-eyed, married to a man who owned the second-largest cattle operation in the county, and who had the particular quality of successful men who believe their success confirms everything they already thought about themselves. Hattie had spent 23 years managing her husband Franklin's business interests, his social relationships, and his considerable ego, and she had gotten very good at moving things in directions that suited her without appearing to push. She did not like Martha Boone. This was not personal, or rather, it was not entirely personal. It had started as practical. The north parcel of the Hayes property sat between the Voss grazing land and the creek, and Franklin had been trying to acquire it for 4 years. Colton Hayes had refused to sell every time the subject was raised, politely and then less politely, and Franklin had eventually concluded that Hayes was simply not a man who sold land. Hattie had not yet concluded this. Hattie thought most men could be moved if you found the right lever, and she had not found Colton's yet, and then Martha Boone had arrived and complicated everything. Because now there was a story, and stories were powerful things on the frontier where people had limited entertainment and long winters and considerable interest in each other's business. The story was this. A strange woman of no known background had attached herself to a solitary rancher, was living in his home, and had, according to the account now spreading through the territory, made herself indispensable during the blizzard in a way that conveniently positioned her as the center of the Hayes household. Hattie looked at this story and saw an opportunity dressed as a problem. She began carefully. A word here. A question there. The kind of doubt you plant not by saying something directly, but by saying something adjacent to it, and letting other people's imaginations fill in the rest. I just wonder what her intentions are, she said to Rebecca Drummond after church on the first Sunday the roads were passable. A woman of her age showing up with nothing, no family, no references. It's strange, don't you think? And Colton Hayes has always been so trusting. Rebecca Drummond thought about most things exactly as long as the last person who talked to her thought about them. By Tuesday, she had passed the observation, slightly enlarged, to 4 other women, taking advantage of a good man's kindness. Nobody knows anything about her past. Probably after the property, what else would she want? Franklin Voss says it's not right, a decent man's reputation being used that way. Martha heard pieces of this through Della, who remained her most reliable source of accurate information about what inaccurate things were being said about her. Della had a gift for delivering bad news with the same practical directness she used for everything else, which Martha found considerably easier to receive than either sympathy or sugarcoating. Hattie's been busy, Della said, on a gray December morning when Martha had come to town for supplies. They were standing beside Della's wagon on the main road, and Della kept her voice low in the automatic way of someone who has learned that conversations outdoors carry further than expected. She's got people asking whether Colton had a will drawn up before you arrived, and whether anyone witnessed anything in writing between you two. Martha was quiet for a moment. She's trying to make it a legal question. She's trying to make it a question that sounds legal, Della said, which is different and worse, because legal questions have answers, and this kind just floats around making people nervous. What do people believe? Della looked at her honestly. The ones who were in that cabin during the blizzard? They don't believe a word of it. Tom Morrison about near bit Roy Drummond's head off last week when Roy repeated something Hattie'd said. She paused. The ones who weren't there are more susceptible. Martha nodded slowly. There's something else, Della said. Franklin Voss went to see Colton 3 days ago. Martha looked up. Colton didn't tell you? No. She kept her voice neutral, but something tightened in her chest. Della seemed to weigh something. Franklin made him an offer on the north parcel, considerably above market, apparently, and he suggested, not quite directly, the way Franklin does things, that the offer was contingent on certain changes in Colton's domestic arrangements. The cold that moved through Martha then was not from the December air. He told Colton to send me away, she said. He strongly implied that a man whose judgment was being questioned by the community might benefit from demonstrating that the questions were unfounded. Della said it carefully, the way you say things you didn't create and don't endorse. I thought you should know. Martha walked back to where she'd tied the horse with the particular focused stillness of a woman processing something she hadn't decided how to feel about yet. She loaded her supplies into the saddlebags. Colton had taught her to ride the shorter route on horseback a month ago, and she'd gotten competent at it, if not exactly graceful. And she stood for a moment with her hand on the horse's neck. Colton hadn't told her. That fact sat in her chest, and she turned it over carefully, the way you turn over a stone that might have something under it. There were several explanations. He might have dismissed the conversation as not worth repeating. He might have handled it and considered it closed. He might be unsure how to bring it up, or he might be considering it. She rode back to the ranch with her jaw set and the wind in her face, and she was honest with herself about the fact that she didn't know which possibility frightened her most. He was repairing the fence along the east pasture when she got back, a section that had buckled under the snow weight, the posts tilted at angles that would not survive spring if they weren't addressed now. She put the horse up, unloaded the supplies, and went out to where he was working. She watched him for a moment from the gate. He was focused on the work, pulling wire taut with a fence tool, resetting a post with methodical force. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. He hadn't heard her yet. Della told me about Franklin Voss, she said. The fence tool went still. He didn't turn around immediately. Della talks a lot, he said to the fence post. Della talks accurately, Martha said. Which is different. He turned then. His face had the particular expression of a man who had been hoping to choose his own timing on something and hadn't gotten to. It was nothing, he said. An above-market offer on your north parcel with conditions attached is not nothing. He looked at her for a moment, set the fence tool down on the top rail. What do you want me to say, Martha? I want you to tell me what you told him. I told him no. To the offer or to the condition? Both, he said. They came packaged together, which told me everything I needed to know about the offer. She held his eyes. Why didn't you tell me? He was quiet long enough that she could hear the wind working through the fence wire. Because it wasn't your problem to carry, he said finally. It was mine. It's about me, she said. That makes it mine too. I handled it. That's not the point. She could hear the edge in her own voice and didn't try to soften it. I've been managing my own troubles since before you were old enough to shave, Colton. I don't need protecting from information about my own situation. I need to know the ground I'm standing on. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite chastened, but genuinely considering. You're right, he said. I should have told you. She hadn't expected the concession to come that cleanly, and it took some of the wind out of what she'd been prepared to say next. She exhaled. What did Franklin say exactly? He told her. All of it. The careful phrasing, the way the offer had been presented as concern rather than pressure. The implication that Martha's presence was damaging Colton's standing in the community, and that a man of sense would recognize this and act accordingly. He told it without editorializing, in the flat, factual way he reported most things. He said the community has questions about your character, Colton finished, and that a man's neighbors are his greatest asset on the frontier, and you can't afford to lose them over. He stopped. Over a woman nobody wanted, Martha said. He didn't use those words. He didn't have to. She looked out over the snow-covered pasture. A group of cattle stood near the far fence in the particular clustered way of animals that were cold but not suffering. What do you actually want to do, Colton? I told you. I told him no. I know what you told him. I'm asking what you want. She turned to look at him directly. Because this isn't a small thing. Franklin Voss has considerable influence in this territory. If he decides to make your life difficult, he can. Grazing rights disputes, water access, market access for your cattle. A man with his connections can make a lot of things harder without ever doing anything technically wrong. I know that. So I'm asking you to look me in the eye and tell me that keeping me here is worth that to you. Not as charity, not as stubbornness. Because you've thought it through and you've decided. He looked at her. His eyes were steady and direct and slightly irritated, which she'd come to recognize as his natural expression when he was being completely honest. I haven't thought about sending you away, he said. Not for 1 minute. Not when Voss showed up, and not before that, and not now. He picked up the fence tool. You're the only thing on this ranch that's worked right in 6 years. I'd have to be a damn fool to change that because Franklin Voss wants another 50 acres. Martha looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, he said, and turned back to the fence. She walked back to the cabin. Her heart was doing something complicated inside her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. The confrontation that people had been waiting for, the public one, the visible one, came in January at the monthly ranchers' meeting held in the back room of the Silverhorn Saloon. These meetings were ostensibly about territorial concerns, water rights, predator management, market pricing. But in practice, they were also where the community's social arithmetic got done, where alliances were confirmed and complaints aired and standing measured. Colton went because he always went. Martha went because Colton asked her to, and because she'd learned enough about frontier dynamics to know that absence was interpreted as either guilt or weakness, and she was neither. The room had 14 men and 4 women in it, which was a better female representation than most such meetings managed. Martha recognized most of them by now. The Morrisons, the Pedersons, the Garretts, several faces from town she knew by sight, if not by name. Hattie Voss sat beside her husband in the front row with the straight-back composure of a woman who had arranged the furniture of a room before arriving in it. Franklin Voss ran the meeting, as he usually did, not because anyone had formally elected him to do so, but because he was the largest landowner in the room and had the particular manner of men who assume authority as a natural condition of their existence. He moved through the legitimate business efficiently. There was a discussion about a pack of wolves that had been working the eastern grazing lands, a water rights question regarding a shared creek tributary, a concern about market prices for the spring cattle drive. Martha sat beside Colton and listened and said nothing, because this was not her meeting in any formal sense, and she understood the difference between being present and overstepping. It was toward the end that Franklin shifted. There's a matter of community concern I'd like to raise, he said, in the tone of a man who has been waiting patiently for this part. It relates to standards of conduct in the territory and what kind of example we're setting for our families. He didn't look at Colton directly when he said this. He didn't need to. The entire room knew exactly what he was talking about, and the ones who didn't had been informed by their neighbors' expressions. An unmarried woman living in a man's home without proper arrangement, Franklin continued, sends a particular kind of message. I think most people in this room understand what I'm referring to. And I think most of us agree that this territory's reputation depends on the kind of community we choose to be. The room was very quiet. Tom Morrison, sitting 3 seats from Martha, had gone stiff. She could see it in his shoulders. I've spoken privately with Colton about this, Franklin said. I'd hoped it would be addressed quietly, since it hasn't been. I'd like to say something. The voice was Clara Morrison's. Clara was sitting against the side wall with her new son. He was nearly 2 months old now, solid and growing, named James after. She had told Martha, the person who'd helped bring him into the world safely. She was still recovering her full strength, and her voice was not loud, but in the silence of that room it carried clearly. I'd like to say something, she repeated, if it's allowed. Shaky, sheepo. Franklin looked at her with the calibrated patience of a man who was not going to be the one to silence a nursing mother in public. Of course, Clara. Clara looked at her husband briefly. Tom gave her a single nod. Martha Boone delivered my son, Clara said. In a blizzard. In that man's cabin. She nodded toward Colton. She did it because she was there, and she knew how, and she didn't hesitate for a second when I needed her. She paused. My son is healthy. I am healthy. That is because of Martha Boone. The room received this in silence. Then Elsa Pettersson, 71 years old, Swedish, and apparently entirely unconcerned about Franklin Voss's opinion of anything, said in her precise, accented English, she also managed the food and the fire and kept 14 people from panicking in that cabin for 2 days. I have seen worse emergency management from men with formal authority. She folded her hands in her lap. I find the questions about her character to be without foundation. Daniel Garrett, whose chest cough had cleared completely by Christmas with the help of Martha's poultice treatments, said, Same. I've got no complaint about Martha Boone. Franklin's composure had not cracked, but it had tightened. I understand the gratitude, he said. That's not what's in question. Then what is? Colton said. The room shifted. Colton had not stood up. He was still sitting, which somehow made it more effective. The stillness of a man who doesn't need the height to make his point. Because I've listened to the concern, Colton said, and I've tried to understand what exactly the problem is. She keeps my house. She cooks my meals. She kept 14 of your families warm and fed and alive during the worst storm this territory's seen in 4 years. She delivered Tom Morrison's son. He looked around the room steadily. If someone can tell me specifically what the improper conduct is, I'll hear it. But it looks unusual is not a standard of conduct. It's a standard of comfort, and I'm not interested in rearranging my home for the sake of other people's comfort. Franklin opened his mouth. I'm not finished, Colton said, and something in his voice made Franklin close it again. Martha Boone came to this territory with nothing because family she trusted let her down. She has not asked a single person in this room for anything. She has earned her place on my property by working harder than most of the men I know, and she's done it without complaining about the fact that some of you have spent the winter treating her like a problem to be solved. He paused. That ends now. She's under my roof, and she's going to stay there for as long as she chooses. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to bring it to me directly. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and the room is deciding how to absorb it. Hattie Voss was looking at her hands. Franklin Voss was looking at Colton with the expression of a man recalculating a situation. Roy Morrison, who was 9 years old and had no business being in this meeting but had been allowed because his father had no one to leave him with, was looking at Colton with unconcealed admiration. Martha was looking at the table in front of her. Her hands were folded on it. They were steady. She had made them steady because the room was watching her, and she was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing otherwise. But underneath that stillness, something was moving in her chest that she couldn't quite contain, and it had nothing to do with the argument she'd just witnessed. and everything to do with something she'd been careful not to look at too directly since the night Colton Hayes had asked a tired woman on a depot bench if she'd eaten. The meeting concluded shortly after, without resolution or formal vote, because there was nothing formal to vote on, and Franklin Voss was shrewd enough to know when a room had moved against him. He and Hattie left with the dignified speed of people who were repositioning rather than retreating. Outside in the cold January evening, people dispersed to their horses and wagons. Several stopped to speak briefly to Martha, a hand on her arm, a word, a look that communicated more than the words did. Tom Morrison gripped her hand and said simply, "Thank you. Again." She nodded and managed not to say anything that would embarrass them both. Colton brought the wagon around without ceremony, and she climbed up and they drove north out of town in the dark. The same road they'd traveled for the first time in October, the same stars above the same ridge. They were quiet for a long time. "You didn't have to do that," Martha said when they were far enough from town that the lights had disappeared behind them. "I did," he said. "It'll cost you. With Voss." "Probably." "I don't want to be the reason your life here gets harder," she said. That was never what I intended." "I know what you intended," Colton said. "You intended to find your family, and your family failed you, and you ended up on my bench. That's it." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't ask me to get in the middle of any of this. I chose to. That's mine." She looked at his profile in the dark, the set of his jaw, the particular way he held the reins, the steadiness of him. "Why?" she asked, and she meant more than just tonight. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, the way he sometimes didn't when a question touched something close. "Because nobody else was going to," he said. Then, after a pause, "and because you deserve better than what you were getting." The horses' hooves were steady on the frozen road. Above them, the sky was clear and cold and vast, the way it always was out here, the kind of sky that makes you feel small and held at the same time. She had spent 58 years learning that the world did not owe her anything. She had learned it through hard harvests and debt and loss, and the letter in her coat pocket that used the word burden. She had held that knowledge tight and used it to stay upright and not ask for things that wouldn't come. Sitting in this wagon on this dark road, she felt something in that knowledge shift. Not break, not disappear, but move. Like a stone that has been in one place so long, it's left a mark in the ground, and you realize you can lift it. She did not say anything else for the rest of the ride. But when they reached the ranch and Colton climbed down and offered his hand to help her from the wagon, the same practical, unadorned gesture he always made, not romantic, just there, she took it, and she held it a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He noticed. She could tell from the way he went slightly still. Neither of them said anything about it. They went inside and Martha built up the fire and Colton checked on the horses, and the cabin settled into its evening sounds, the particular vocabulary of a small structure working against the cold. Logs shifting, wind at the north wall, the quiet pop of the fire finding its rhythm. Two people who had stopped pretending they were merely practical about each other moved through the familiar space of a home they had made from nothing, and neither of them said the thing that was accumulating between them, because some things need time before they can be spoken without breaking. But the fire was warm, and the night outside was cold, and that, for now, was enough. Winter on the frontier does not release its grip graciously. It loosens slowly, reluctantly, the way a fist opens when the thing it's been holding has finally gone still. February was bitter and gray and long. March came in with a week of false warmth that got everyone's hopes up before slamming back down into frost. The mud season, that particular misery unique to places where the ground thaws unevenly and turns every road into a negotiation, ran through most of April, making trips to town into events that required planning and acceptance of the possibility that you would not make it back the same day. Through all of it, the Hayes Ranch kept working. Martha had started keeping a ledger in February. Nothing formal, just a small notebook she'd found in the bottom of her trunk, the kind she used to use for household accounts back in Ohio. She wrote down what came in and what went out, what the garden would need come spring, what the cattle numbers looked like against projected feed costs, what repairs were highest priority when the ground softened enough to work. She did not show it to Colton. She did it because she couldn't help doing it, The same way she couldn't help waking before dawn, or fixing things that were broken, or noticing when the flour was running low. She found it on the kitchen table one morning in early March. She'd left it there the night before, and she came in to find Colton sitting with his coffee, reading it. She stopped in the doorway. He didn't look up immediately. He turned another page with the careful attention of someone reading something that had surprised them. "The east fence repair," he said, finally. "You've got it estimated at 3 days. 2.5 if the ground cooperates," she said, coming in and going to the stove. "But I budgeted 3 in case. The seed costs for the garden are off. Cornmeal seed has gone up since last spring. I based it on what Horton was charging in November. You're right. I should adjust." She poured her coffee. "I can correct it." He closed the notebook. He looked at it for a moment, sitting on the table between his hands. "Martha, I know it's not my ledger to keep," she said, before he could. It's a habit. I kept accounts for 26 years, and I can't stop seeing the numbers. If it bothers you, It doesn't bother me." He looked up. "It's the best accounting this ranch has ever had. I usually just guess." She looked at him. "You guess, more or less." Something in his expression was almost sheepish, which was an expression she hadn't seen on him before and was mildly startling on that particular face. "I know cattle. I don't know numbers. You've been running 800 acres on guesswork. Educated guesswork. Colton. It's been fine. You have been leaving significant money on the table every market season. I can tell that just from what I've observed since October." She sat down across from him. "How do you price your cattle for the drive?" "What the other ranchers are getting, roughly, which means you're pricing to the average of a group that also doesn't know what their actual costs are." She picked up the ledger and opened it to the page she'd been working on. "Look, if you track your actual feed costs against weight gain and price per head, you can see—" "Show me," he said. She looked up. "Show me how it works," he said. "I'm not too proud to learn something." She had been prepared for resistance. The lack of it left her momentarily without a plan. She recovered quickly. She usually did, and turned the ledger around and began to explain. They sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours, the coffee going cold, the fire burning down, and neither of them noticing until the room got noticeably chillier. Colton asked good questions, not the questions of someone performing interest, but the focused questions of a person who has understood the shape of a problem and wants to understand the mechanics. He argued with her twice about her estimates, once correctly and once not, and she told him so both times, and he accepted the correction without drama. At some point during that 2 hours, something shifted between them that neither of them named. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing that announces itself. It was more like the moment when you've been walking in fog and you take a step and you realize the ground has changed under you. Not dangerously, just differently. And you look around and realize you've come further than you thought. Spring, when it actually arrived, was tentative, and then suddenly committed. The mud receded. The ground firmed up. The grass came back in long, slow waves of green moving across the pasture from south to north, following the sun. Martha's garden, the one she'd spent 4 months planning on paper and dreaming about during the hard weeks of February, went in the first week of May. She planted more than she needed for 2 people, and she did this deliberately. The excess would be preserved. Some of it would go to Della's, who had offered to buy from her at fair price. Some of it would go to the Morrison family, because Claire's recovery had been longer than expected, and Tom's hands were full. Roy Morrison came to help plant on 2 consecutive Saturdays, which had been his mother's idea and was clearly also his own. The boy had taken a shine to the ranch that Martha suspected had more to do with Colton's horses than with anything else. Colton put him to work in the barn on those days, teaching him things about horses and tack and equipment with the patient, practical pedagogy of a man who had learned everything the same way and saw no reason to make it more complicated than it needed to be. Martha watched this from the garden on the second Saturday. Colton crouched beside the boy, showing him something about a bridle fitting, both of them intent on the small mechanics of the thing, and felt a complicated warmth that she couldn't entirely account for. The territory was also watching, though with different eyes than it had in November. The blizzard had done what the blizzard did. It had made people honest about what mattered. The families who had sheltered in the Hayes cabin carried that memory differently than they carried Hattie Voss's carefully planted doubts, and the weight of the two things was not equal. When spring came and people emerged from their cabins and started talking again, the talk had changed its shape. She saved Clara's baby was a harder thing to argue against than she might be after his land. It had the considerable advantage of being a fact that 14 people had witnessed. Hattie Voss did not give up easily. She was not built that way. But even she seemed to understand by April that the ground had shifted against her. She stopped mentioning Martha in her public conversations. She redirected her energy toward a water rights dispute with the Pedersen family that had more traction. She did not apologize and was not expected to. Franklin Voss made one more attempt on the North Parcel in April through the Territorial Land Office. A formal inquiry about the property's status and whether it was being actively worked to the degree required to maintain the claim. Colton's response was a letter from the county land assessor confirming that the Hayes property was in full productive use and that no claim dispute was currently recognized. Martha had helped him write the letter. He had signed it. The inquiry went nowhere. It was in the third week of May that Colton asked her to ride out to the North Parcel with him. He had a reason, a legitimate one. There was a section of fence he wanted her to see, one where the posts were questionable, and he wanted a second opinion on whether to replace them now or wait for fall. This was the kind of thing they had fallen into naturally over the months. He asked for her opinion on things, and she gave it without softening it, and he did the same for her, and between them they made better decisions than either made alone. But she could tell from the way he asked, and the particular quality of the morning he chose, clear sky, warm sun, the kind of May day that makes the world look like it has been freshly decided, that the fence was not entirely the point. They rode out together, which they did sometimes now. She had gotten better at riding, genuinely better, not just competent, but comfortable, able to let the horse do the work instead of fighting it the whole way. Colton had noticed this about 3 weeks ago and said, "You figured out how to trust her," meaning the horse, and Martha had said, "I figured out she knows what she's doing," and he'd said, "That's the same thing," and she'd thought about that for several days afterward. The North Parcel was beautiful in May. That was the simple truth of it. The grass was long and green and moved in long waves under the spring wind. The creek that ran along the western boundary had the high, clear sound of snowmelt still working through the system. There were wildflowers beginning along the fence line, small yellow ones she didn't know the name of, and something purple that she meant to ask about. Colton stopped at the fence section in question, and they looked at it together, and she said what she thought. 3 of the posts needed replacing now. The other 2 could wait until fall if he kept an eye on them. And he agreed with 2 of those assessments and argued about the third until she showed him the rot at the base of the post, and then he conceded the point. Then they stood there for a moment, both looking at the creek. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." He didn't start immediately. She waited because she'd learned by now that with Colton, the pause before something important was just how he organized his words, not a sign of uncertainty about whether to say them. "7 months ago," he said, "I asked you if you'd eaten, and you told me it wasn't my concern." She felt something move in her chest. "I remember. And you came here because you had no better option, and I offered you a room because it seemed like the practical thing to do." He was still looking at the creek, and somewhere in between then and now, it stopped being about practical. Martha said nothing. She was looking at the water. "I know I'm not an easy person," he said. "I know I leave my boots in the wrong place, and I don't talk enough. And I spent 6 years doing everything wrong with this ranch because I didn't know what I didn't know." He paused. "And I know you're 58 years old, and you've been through more than most people. And you came out here to find family, and it failed you. And the last thing you probably need is another person asking something of you." "Colton," she said, "let me finish." He turned to look at her then. His face was the same face she'd been looking at for 7 months, weathered and direct, and not particularly good at hiding things when he'd stopped trying to. "I want you to stay, not in the back room, not because you work hard and the place runs better with you in it, though both those things are true." He stopped. "I want you to stay because He exhaled, the particular exhale of a man who has run up against the edge of his own vocabulary. "I'm better at this than I'm doing right now." Despite everything, Martha almost smiled. "You're doing fine." "I want to marry you," he said. Plain and direct, the the same way he said everything. If you'll have me. Not because you need a roof or I need a cook, because 7 months ago this was a house with 4 walls and now it's a home. And the difference between those two things is you, and I don't want to go back to what it was before. The creek ran alongside them. The yellow wildflowers moved in the wind. Martha looked at Colton Hayes, this man who had walked toward her instead of past her, who had lifted her trunk without being asked, who had sat up all night during a blizzard so other people's families would be safe, who had stood up in a room full of his neighbors and said the thing that needed to be said because it was simply true and he wasn't willing to pretend otherwise, who left his boots in the wrong place and ran 800 acres on guesswork and couldn't finish a sentence when it mattered to him most. She thought about James, the way she still did sometimes, not with the raw grief of the first year, but with the settled, honest love of someone who carries the dead with them as part of who they are. James would have liked Colton Hayes. She believed that clearly and without effort. He would have recognized him. The same practical decency, the same lack of interest in performing himself for anyone. She thought about the depot bench and the letter in her coat pocket and the long, cold night when she'd believed her life had reached its final, lonely chapter. Life had a quality she'd never been able to adequately name, its tendency to arrange the things that matter in places you'd never think to look. You lose a farm and end up on a train. You follow a promise that fails and end up on a bench in the dark. Someone walks toward you instead of past you, and everything after that is different. I need to tell you something first, she said. He waited. I am not easy either, she said. I reorganize things without asking. I will always have an opinion about the accounts. I will fix things that don't necessarily need fixing, and sometimes I'll be wrong about whether they needed fixing, and I'll have a hard time admitting it. She looked at him steadily. I wake up before dawn every day of my life, and I'm not going to stop. I still think about James, and I'm not going to apologize for that or pretend I don't. She paused. And I don't fully know yet who I am without the grief. I'm still working that out. I know, he said. You say that now. I've known you for 7 months, he said. You've reorganized my kitchen twice. You argued with me about fence posts 20 minutes ago, and you were right, which you knew before I did. And you wake up before dawn, and you've had the fire going before I'm out of bed every single morning since October. The not-quite smile was there, brief and real. I'm not proposing to a version of you I made up. I know what I'm asking for. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes? Did you want me to repeat it? No. Something moved across his face. Relief, and something larger than relief, something that had been waiting to surface for a while. No. Once was enough. He reached out and took her hand. Not the practiced gesture of a practiced man, but the slightly awkward, completely sincere gesture of someone for whom this kind of thing did not come easily and who was doing it anyway. His hand was rough and warm, and she folded her own around it. They stood by the creek in the May sunlight for a while, not saying anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said right at that moment. The water moved, the grass moved. The yellow wildflowers, whose name she still didn't know, moved along the fence line. They got married on the first Saturday in June, in the yard of the Hayes Ranch because it was the place that made sense. Della organized the food. She showed up 2 days before with more than anyone had asked for and considerable opinions about the arrangement of the tables. And Martha let her because Della's opinions about tables were generally correct. Tom and Clara Morrison came with their children and the baby James, who had grown enormously since November and was currently attempting to eat a flower. Elsa Pedersen came, sharp-eyed and warmly approving. The Garretts came, Daniel with a clear chest and a firm handshake. Roy Morrison wore his best shirt and stood very straight, and when Martha asked him later what he'd thought of the wedding, he said it was fine, but he was more interested in whether he could come back next Saturday to learn about the bridal fitting. There was no formal officiant. The territory's circuit preacher was 3 days' ride away, and they hadn't waited. A neighboring rancher named Birch, who had some legal standing in these matters from his time as a county official in Missouri, read the relevant words. Martha and Colton said yes at the right moments, and it was, by any reasonable measure, sufficient. Hattie Voss did not attend. Nobody mentioned this. Franklin Voss sent a brief letter of congratulations that read like it had been written by someone who'd lost a negotiation and was being gracious about it. Colton read it once and used it to level a table leg that had been wobbling since September. The party ran until the evening, the kind of frontier celebration that is modest in its materials and generous in its feeling, where people eat too much and talk too loud, and someone inevitably produces a fiddle from somewhere, and the children run themselves to exhaustion in the last of the summer light. Martha stood in her own yard, her yard now. She kept having to remind herself, and watched the people who had sheltered in this house during the worst storm of the winter, laughing in the warm evening. And she thought about how the same walls that had held 14 frightened people in November were now holding something entirely different, and how that was the particular miracle of a home, that it expands to hold whatever is brought to it. She found Colton beside her at some point in the evening, both of them watching the yard. Roy Morrison having somehow acquired a fiddle of his own and producing sounds from it that were enthusiastic, if not entirely musical. "The boy needs lessons," Colton said. "The boy needs to be 9 for a while longer before anyone tells him that," Martha said. He made the sound that she'd come to understand was his version of laughing. She looked out at all of it. The people, the light going gold over the pasture, the garden visible along the south wall of the cabin with its summer growth, the barn with its repaired east siding, the fence line on the distant pasture that now had all 5 posts properly set. "Are you all right?" Colton asked. She thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about all things. She was 58 years old. Her knees ached in cold weather and probably always would. She still woke with James's name in her chest some mornings, that particular shape of loss that doesn't disappear but changes. She had $11.40 when she arrived, and she had a husband and a home and a garden and a community that had made its decision about her now. And none of it had happened the way she'd expected any of it to happen. The world does not owe you a plan. She had learned that. It does not promise that the things you build will stand, or that the people you love will stay, or that the family you travel 4 days to find will be there when you arrive. It gives you the day you're in and the choices inside that day, and the rest is what you make of the chances that come sideways, when you weren't looking, from directions you didn't expect. A man walking toward you instead of past you. That's how it starts sometimes. That's all it takes. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." The years that followed were not perfect, because nothing is, and the frontier doesn't offer perfect as one of its options. There were hard seasons, a dry summer in 1890 that tested the cattle numbers and required a recalculation of everything in Martha's ledger that had been carefully built up over 3 years. A dispute with a neighboring property over a water tributary that took 18 months to resolve and cost them both in legal fees, and the specific exhaustion of a sustained argument. A winter when Colton's shoulder gave out, and she ran most of the property herself for 6 weeks, which she managed and never entirely forgave her own body for finding so difficult. Colton's ranch became known as a place that did not turn people away. This happened gradually, without announcement, simply because Martha could not watch someone go hungry if there was food available, and Colton could not watch her feed someone and object to it. Travelers were fed. Women passing through alone were offered the back room, the room that had been Martha's in the beginning, without the kind of questions that made people feel like charity cases. 2 orphan children, a brother and sister aged 7 and 10 whose family had died of fever in the summer of 1891, stayed for what was supposed to be a temporary arrangement and were quietly still there 3 years later, which suited everyone involved better than any formal discussion of the situation probably would have. Roy Morrison grew up and learned to ride properly, and eventually went to work for the Hayes Ranch at 17, by which point he could also play the fiddle with some degree of mercy to the listener. Clara Morrison's baby James grew up calling Martha Aunt Martha, which she had not asked for or expected, and which worked on her in ways she didn't examine too closely. Hattie Voss, in the winter of 1892, lost her own health to a prolonged illness that kept her in bed for 3 months. Martha sent food twice, not out of sentimentality or forgiveness exactly, but out of the practical belief that you do not let people go hungry in winter regardless of what they've said about you. And also because Hattie Voss sick in bed was considerably less dangerous than Hattie Voss well, and active and resentful. Hattie did not thank her directly. She did stop speaking against her, which was perhaps the closest thing to gratitude she knew how to offer. Martha accepted it at face value. Franklin Voss eventually bought a different parcel from a family that left the territory in 1893. He seemed, if not reconciled to Colton's existence, at least resigned to it. They nodded to each other at community meetings and never became friends and were never going to, which was honest and fine. The ranch kept going. The ledger kept accurate records. The garden kept producing more than 2 people needed and kept finding people who needed it. The back room kept being occupied by someone who had nowhere else to go. And on the evenings, when the work was done and the house was quiet, or as quiet as a house gets when it has acquired the sounds of other people living in it, the particular density of a place that has become a home to more than its original inhabitants, Colton and Martha sat by the fireplace in the 2 chairs that had been there when she arrived, and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. And the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because it's already full. There's a thing people say about second chances, that they are rare, that you have to earn them, that they require some transformation of yourself before you're worthy of them. Martha Boone had thought this once. She had thought, sitting on that bench in the October dark, with a letter that called her a burden, that whatever came next would require her to become someone she wasn't in order to deserve it. She had been wrong about that. What it required was simply this: not giving up before the next thing arrived, keeping her back straight and her hands steady and staying present in the moment she was in rather than the future she feared. And when a man walked toward her instead of past her and asked a simple human question, "Have you eaten today?" being willing to say yes, I could use something, even if she said it sideways, even if she said it as all right, but I won't be charity. The willingness to be helped is its own kind of courage. Nobody talks about that enough. It is easy to be strong alone. It is considerably harder to let strength be something 2 people hold between them. She learned that at 58 years old, on a bench in the dark, from a man who had enough decency to stop. On the last evening before the first snowfall of 1895, she knew it was coming. She always knew now, could read the particular pressure in the air and the behavior of the cattle and the color of the sky to the northwest. She stood in the yard and looked at the ranch in the fading light, the barn with its repaired siding, the garden put to bed for winter, the fence line running straight along the pasture edge, the cabin with light in the windows and the sound of the children inside, arguing about something inconsequential with the wholehearted commitment that children bring to inconsequential things. Colton came to stand beside her. "Snow tonight," she said. "I know." He'd learned to read it too by now. Already brought the extra wood in. She nodded. They stood together looking at the property in the last of the day's light. 8 years ago, she had sat on a bench with $11 and a letter that told her she was nobody's responsibility. Now she was standing on ground that had her name on the deed alongside his, watching light in the windows she'd cleaned last week, in the yard of a home that had been built from nothing more complicated than the decision to not look away. "You know what I've been thinking about?" she said. That cat, November, the orange one I told Beth Morrison about during the blizzard." He looked at her. "I never did have another cat," she said, "after I left Ohio." A pause. "There's a barn cat," he said. "She had kittens in September." "I know. I've been feeding them." "I noticed." "The orange one," she said, "is very persistent." "Is that so?" "He follows me to the garden." Another pause. "Seems like he's already yours," Colton said. She almost smiled, looking out at the last of the light. "Seems like," she said. The snow came that night quietly, the way the best things often come, without announcement, settling over everything while the house was warm and the people inside it were sleeping. By morning, the world was white and still, and the Hayes Ranch sat in the middle of it like something that had always been there, like something that had grown from the ground up rather than been assembled piece by careful piece from the wreckage of harder things. But it had been assembled from those pieces, by those hands, and it held